Today I'm going to start kind of a series of a message through the New Testament, but it's not just going to be a simple go through the New Testament. It's kind of be a connection between the Old and New Testament, because I'm basically going to be reading the New Testament through the eyes of the Old Testament, because it's important to know, because these things that happened in the Old Testament have extreme relevance to what takes place in the New Testament. And so I'm going to start, as anyone would start when you're starting through the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 1. Now, if you know anything about it, if you've read it at all, Matthew chapter 1, the beginning of it is just a genealogy, tracing Jesus' lineage from Abraham to him. And I'm not going to lie, that in itself can be pretty tedious and very boring. But when you consider the people that are mentioned in here and the things that they had to go through and the promises that God made to them, you can see that this genealogy is proof that God keeps his promises. Now, if you go all the way back to Adam, all the way to the beginning, the very first man, Jesus traces his physical ancestry all the way back there to Adam, along with the plan of salvation, because God's plan of salvation started when Adam sinned. And if you look at Luke chapter 3, because I'm going to be doing kind of a parallel thing, Luke chapter 3 traces Jesus' lineage back to Adam. Now, Matthew's doesn't go back that far, but Luke's does. And you can see that it's traced back to Adam. Also, you can find more in detail about that in Genesis 5, from Adam to Noah, and then after Noah and the flood, Noah had some sons, and you can, in Genesis 11, you can trace from Noah to Abraham. And so, then when you get to Matthew chapter 1, you see it's explained how Jesus was in fact the son of David, who was also the son of Abraham. And it's important to know that there were two promises that were fulfilled when Jesus was born. The first is the promise to Abraham that he will be the father of nations. If Jesus is in fact the descendant of Abraham, as the records indicate, then everybody who becomes a follower of Christ is adopted into that family that God promised to Abraham in Genesis 15. Now I'm going to go ahead and read that, and I'll start in Genesis 15, just start in verse 1. It says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram. Abraham was known as Abram at the time. Came to Abram in a vision, fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. Now Abraham at this time was thinking, yeah, okay, I have no heir, so my heir must be Eleazar, who was kind of like his servant slash like a son to him. So Abraham thought, okay, this must be my heir. But if you read in verse 4, you see, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And when it says your very own son, the Hebrew for that is, it says from your loins, or what will come out of your own loins. And so that's God saying, no, your heir is not going to be somebody who's like an adopted son to you. He's going to be your blood son that comes from you, from your body. And then in chapter 5, God brought Abraham outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. He says, count the stars, see if you can count them all. And then he said, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and it counted to him as righteousness. So Abraham believed God that his offspring would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But he had a hard time with this. I think anybody would. Because Abraham was already an old man with no children at the time, whenever God made this promise to him. He was in his 80s. But the promise was fulfilled through Christ, because, as I said, when we become followers of Christ, we are adopted into that family, along with the Jews who were born directly descended from Abraham and his sons, and everyone who is physically a part of that family. We as Christians, when we accept Christ into our hearts, are also added to that family. And the Jews who were born from that, they were from Isaac and Jacob. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old, and his wife was 90 years old. And if you tried to count all the Jews and Christians throughout all of history, you wouldn't be able to number them, because there's just too many, just as God promised to Abraham. Another promise is the promise that God made to David in 2 Samuel 7. He promised him that his throne would be established forever. I'm going to read this as well. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and I'm going to start in verse 12. God's speaking to David here, and he says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers and you die, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house, this is the promise, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. God made that promise to David, that his throne would be established forever. And I can see that at the time, throughout history, there were people, I have no doubt, who believed that this promise would not be fulfilled, or that God had gone back on his promise. Because after David's death, his son Solomon, as everyone knows, is like the wisest man who ever lived, aside from Jesus, even he was not totally right. In his later years, he turned to idolatry. And after his death, his sons were horrible. The kingdom of Israel was divided in two, and from that point on, it was the nations of Israel and Judah. And the nation of Israel descended further and further away from the worship of the one true God into idolatry, until eventually their enemies came and overtook them, destroyed their nation, and took all of its people captive. And the nation of Judah followed less than 150 years later, at which time the city of Jerusalem, which was God's chosen city, and the temple, the temple that Solomon had built for God, was destroyed, and God allowed that to happen. And you add in the fact that throughout the centuries, other civilizations have taken control of God's people, God's land, all of that stuff. They had come in, including the Greeks. Alexander the Great, he came in, he took over. The Romans came in, took over. All the emperors of Rome who did these things. Everyone, I mean, Jerusalem in 70